Okay, here we go. So our agenda today is, firstly, my name is Brian O'Kennedy. I'm the Managing Director of Clearstream Solutions, and we're the admin support executive behind the CDP Ireland network. And I'm going to give you a little update on why Scope 3 is important. And then I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Grainne, who's going to take us through Scope 3 demystified, obviously a challenging and complex, sometimes complex area. Grainne is going to unravel it for us. And then it's great pleasure that we have a CDP. We have Hugo Ernst-Jones from CDP Supply Chain with us, and he's going to talk to us about the CDP Supply Chain program. And then I guess possibly, if I can say that the highlight for me, certainly anyway, is a conversation with Ken O'Farrell from Microsoft and Dave Fitzgerald from Kellogg about what they're doing in their supply chains to address Scope 3 emissions. So interesting afternoon. Just as I said, a little bit of housekeeping. We're using Teams, so please, if you could mute your video. We'll have our videos on, but please mute your sound and your video. We will be taking questions via the Teams meeting chat. So you'll see there's a little chat button on Teams. So please, if you want to communicate with us, use that, or you can email Shay at clearstreamsolutions.ie. We are recording the session, and slides will be available afterwards. So if you're having your coffee or your tea and your lunch and you miss something, don't worry, you'll get a chance to revise. So a lot of people ask us what's been happening since COVID as to whether the issue of climate has fallen off the agenda or has it accelerated or changed in any way. And all I can say is that there's actually been a significant increase in the focus. And talking to even Dave Fitzgerald this morning about his experience in terms of all of the activity going on in this space, there's actually been a heightened increase in focus on climate change since COVID. So whether it's that we're more conscious of what's happening in the planet, or whether it's that we have more time or we're just cramming more stuff in, whatever it is, in CDP here in Ireland ourselves, we've seen a huge increase in the number of companies reporting. This year, we've actually seen a 50% increase in the Irish corporate climate change disclosures. So far from this being something which is disappearing or is slipping down the priority list, we're actually seeing climate change become a much more significant issue for businesses and companies. It's not in any way to belittle the dreadful milestone that we hit with a million deaths, but from the longer term perspective, we have a very significant issue ahead. And that's, I guess, just to start with, and thank you for those who responded to the survey. And I would encourage you, if you didn't respond, please go in and respond. It'll take about 2 or 3 minutes, but it's very valuable insight, and we will share it with you after. But here's the feedback in terms of the number of companies that of you who have measured your emissions and to what extent you've measured your emissions. So a significant number of people haven't calculated any emissions at all, so over 25%. And between that and Scope 1 and 2 emissions, probably just under 50%. Quite a big number of you have started to calculate your Scope 3 emissions. And as I said, a relatively small percentage, probably less than 25%, have calculated 1, 2, 3, most of their 3, and all of other relevant emissions. So I think we're in for an interesting conversation today. It looks like it's a topic that a lot of people are struggling to grapple with. Just want to say thanks to the chair, Shane O'Reilly, and Owen Fahy, our vice chair, these hardworking members of the CDP Ireland Steering Committee who give up their time free. Seeing the numbers of increasing responders this year has been a great source of I guess, satisfaction to us, because we've been putting in a lot of hard work over a long time to encourage as many companies to report as possible. We are participating in Climate Finance Week on the 4th of November, and we'll have a discussion on climate reporting at that session. The scores will be released in December, fingers crossed, and we expect to have our CDP Ireland report out in January of 2020. Those of you who are following all the blogs and LinkedIn posts about Climate Week in the US will have seen there's been some significant announcements and developments, and particularly around the alignment. I'm not going to dwell on this, but a couple of very significant announcements is where the corporate reporting dialogue has gone from being a dialogue now to being a commitment. And most of the significant organizations in the world who are engaged in framework reporting and disclosure have all come together to develop a common standard for reporting ESG and sustainability and climate factors. So that's great news for all of us. So let's see how quickly that develops. But as I said, we've gone from dialogue to a commitment. The other interesting, I guess, publication of note is the white paper from the World Economic Forum that was produced by the four big accounting firms, Deloitte, EY, KPMG, and PwC, on, again, alignment of common metrics and consistency in sustainable reporting. So very important developments in the space for us. So very briefly, I just want to give you a quick introduction to why Scope 3 and why we see it as being so important. And the first area is investors. I don't know if three to 4 years ago at our launch of our CDP report, we were very lucky to have this gentleman join us, Murray Burt. He's a senior ESG strategist at DWS. Very pleasant looking chap, but actually he's a deadly assassin. Murray's role is to go around poking in your supply chains to look for risk, climate risk specifically, and opportunity. But his job as a strategist is not, he sees all your nice reports and what people publish, but his job is to dig behind that and look into our supply chains and see whether there's climate risk. So the investor group have been very significantly focused on looking at this topic, and they're one of the big drivers in terms of the increased focus on Scope 3 emissions. Generally, we're seeing a reporting maturity. I mean, we talked about the extra 50% increase in companies reporting here. Companies are getting more comfortable with sustainability reporting and specifically measuring and reporting their carbon emissions. So adding additional Scope 3 items is becoming more common, and they're getting used to some of the areas of lack of certainty and how they might extrapolate. So Grainne is going to talk to us about that a little later, but we are seeing a growth in maturity there. A lot of the focus is driven by the corporate ambition that we're seeing in terms of science-based targets, in terms of net zero targets. So all of these targets require us to validate, verify, and to set emissions targets in our supply chain. So that's driving a lot of organizations to address the issues, not just within our own operational emissions, but our Scope 3 emissions. If we want to set a science-based target or be net zero sometime in the future, we have to focus and factor in Scope 3 emissions. TCFD, another initial task force on financial disclosure. This is trying to put financial measures on our climate risk. And it has a tremendous momentum in terms of organizations using this framework. It's also built into the CDP supply chains or into the CDP response program. So if you're doing CDP, you're addressing a lot of the issues in TCFD, but it's looking at risk and opportunity in our supply chains, right across our value chains. And finally, competition, and I will single out, I know we've got Microsoft on the call, but it was fascinating when they came up with their moonshot about being carbon, obviously carbon neutral, which they've been for some time, but net negative in terms of emissions by 2030. Within, I would say, 3 to 4 weeks, we saw Amazon and Google and others respond to that. So this is a good thing. I mean, we're seeing this organizations compete on their ability to provide lower carbon solutions for their customers. So there's just some perspectives on this, and it was interesting. We asked you similar questions as to where you saw the main importance or the areas of importance in Scope 3 in your organization. And the darker the orange, obviously the greater the response and focus. And the two top areas where most of our emissions are in our supply chain. So you recognize most of your emissions are in Scope 3. Engaging with suppliers was another hot topic, and emissions reduction targets. So again, there's a number of other themes here around resilience and innovation and investor, which we'll come back to, but that certainly bears out what we were suggesting in terms of the main areas of focus. So why are Scope 3 emissions important? Why are they so important? Well, as we said, it's the greatest impact. Most organizations have a minimum of 50 to 80% of their total emissions in their Scope 3 items. And Grainne is going to talk to us a lot more detail. In some sectors, such as retail, it's well over 90%. There's a cost and competitive advantage here. If we go back to 15 years ago, Walmart were the first ones to start measuring carbon emissions in their supply chain. And why? They were looking to reduce and eliminate cost in their supply chain and to develop a competitive advantage. Climate risk I talked about with TCFD. The circular economy, again, most of us know that at least 50% of our emissions are embodied in the materials that we produce. So stuff that we buy. So the ability to keep products and materials alive and in circulation has a big impact on the carbon efficiency of the economy. Employees, brand impact. Our employees are the first ones to know if we're not being authentic about what we're doing in this space and to call BS on our activities. So companies that are leading in this space are doing so because of the impact it has on employee retention and obviously brand impact. Procurement, I like to call it the power of the PO. Having been on the receiving end of this for many, many years, the impact of a customer, a buyer telling us that within the next 3 to 5 years, we're going to go to net zero or whatever it is, and you guys are going to have to come with us if you want to do business with us. You buyers and procurement people in the audience don't realize the impact that you have by setting that kind of pathway out in your procurement strategies and the impact that that has on suppliers. So that sort of engagement between buyers and suppliers is critical to unlock and for us to be able to hit our climate strategies. And finally, innovation. And we've some great case studies here with Microsoft and Kellogg in terms of how these companies are driving innovation in their conversation with their suppliers through a focus on Scope 3 emissions. Briefly, the challenges. We have disconnected systems. So in reality, our value chains are not that simple and not linear, and we have multi-tiers, and we have different suppliers with different issues or concerns, plus these 15 items that we're going to talk to you about in your Scope 3 are all, in a lot of cases, very unrelated. So very challenging for us to put our arms around all of this. And very often the issue of ownership, whether these emissions are ours or third party, and the influence that we can have on reducing them is a key issue. We have siloed operations ourselves. Our designers may not know what happens at end of life. So bringing all of that visibility together into our organizations to be able to affect that supply chain change is difficult. Having tools and data and the ability to be able to understand what's happening across multi-tiers is a real challenge. And we're only getting good at the measurement models. Life cycle footprinting of products, which we do a lot of, is still a relatively new science. So a lot of the measurement models are still relatively new. So I'm delighted to say that we're going to try and, as we discussed, unravel some of these for you over the next approximately hour or so. And I'm now with great pleasure, going to hand over to my colleague, Grainne, who's going to take us through an overview of Scope 3 emissions. Grainne.
Thanks, Brian. Okay, so I'm going to do an overview of Scope 3 emissions and hopefully demystify the Scope 3 emissions in general for everyone. So I'm going to firstly talk about what is Scope 3 emissions and how are they different from operational emissions. Then I'm going to go into measuring Scope 3 emissions and how one might go about that. And then I'm going to end with the journey of Scope 3 and how calculation of emissions in this category might evolve over time. So firstly, what is Scope 3? So we have Ken from Microsoft here today, and I'm sure he'll be delighted to hear that we have a video from Microsoft we're going to play for you. So it'll just go through the basics of Scope 1, Scope 2, Scope 3, and then I'll take it from there.
Consensus is clear. The world has a huge carbon problem. Humans have released this blanket of carbon in our atmosphere. Scientists agree that
I'm just going to skip it to here from to show what's relevant.
That if we don't do anything, temperatures could rise somewhere between 1.5 and 4.5 degrees Celsius. So what can we do? Well, it starts by understanding and getting real about carbon math. Scientists account for carbon emissions by classifying them into 3 categories or scopes. Scope 1 emissions are the direct emissions that your activities create, like the exhaust from the car you drive. Or, for a business, the trucks it drives to transport its products from one place to another, or the diesel generators it might run. Scope 2 emissions are indirect emissions that come from the production of the electricity or heat you use, like the traditional energy sources that light up your home or power the buildings owned by a business. Scope 3 emissions are the indirect emissions that come from all the other activities in which you're engaged, including the emissions associated with producing the food you eat or manufacturing the products that you buy. For a business, these emissions The scientific consensus is clear. The world has a huge carbon problem. Humans have released more than 2 trillion metric tons.
Hopefully you got to see the basics of that video where it explained the difference between Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3. Yeah, I'll go through it now anyway, to reiterate. So Scope 1 emissions is any direct emissions on site or from assets that you own. 2 emissions is any indirect emissions from the electricity that you purchase. And then Scope 3 emissions is pretty much everything else. So any other indirect emissions from activities in your business. So what can be included in Scope 3 emissions? So obviously your direct operations, that's going to be your Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions. And then your Scope 3 emissions can be upstream or downstream. So some things that could be included in your upstream Scope 3 emissions. So business travel, very common. Employees may be going on air travel, maybe not this year, but typically, or claiming back mileage for travel in their own vehicles. Upstream transportation and distribution. So this is any transportation that's coming inbound. Emissions from waste. So for the waste generated within your operations, firstly, what is the waste that's being generated, and then where is it going? So is it going to landfill? Is it being recycled? And what are the emissions associated with those processes? And then upstream water emissions. So this is emissions associated with the processing of water before it reaches the organization. So making sure it's potable water or up to a high enough standard for your for commercial use. Employee commuting. So if you have 5,000 staff in your business who are coming to and from the office every day, what's the emissions impact of that? Is it private car use they're using? Are they using zero emissions vehicles, bikes, etc.? And what is the emissions impact of that? So purchase goods and services. So if you're an office buying a box of pens, what's the emissions associated with manufacturing that pen and getting it to the gate of your organization? Capital goods, so same again here. So what's the emissions associated with manufacturing that capital good and bringing it to the gate of your organization? Other fuel and energy related activities. So this is the hidden emissions associated with fuel and energy. So typically in Scope 1, Scope 2, you'll measure the emissions associated directly from fuel and energy. So for example, let's say you're measuring emissions from the diesel in a vehicle. In Scope 1, Scope 2, you'll measure the emissions associated directly with combusting that diesel within the vehicle. Scope 3 emissions, you may calculate the well to tank emissions of that diesel. So what are the emissions associated with extracting that diesel and bringing it up until the point where it reaches your vehicle, all those kind of upstream emissions. And then similarly with electricity, for every kilowatt hour of electricity you consume, there's going to be a small piece of electricity that's lost to transmission and distribution losses. So what's the emissions associated with generating that energy, which is just lost? And then leased assets. So if your organization rents out any vehicles or any other assets, what's the emissions associated with operating those? Okay, so Then downstream emissions in scope 3, so transportation and distribution. So this is any outbound transportation and distribution. Downstream water emissions, so this is emissions associated with processing wastewater and the emissions associated with that. So processing of sold materials, so say for example you're an organisation who sells raw materials onto another manufacturer and will then manufacture that material into another product. What's the emissions associated with them processing the materials that you've sold to them? Use of sold products, so say for example you're an organisation who sells laptops. What's the emissions associated with the electricity needed to run that laptop for its lifespan, say 5 years or so? And then end of life treatment of that sold product. So at the end of that laptop's lifespan, where is it going to end up? Is it ending up in landfill? Is it being recycled? And what are the emissions associated with that? Leased assets. So downstream leased assets is if you're an organisation that rents out assets to other people, and what are their emissions associated with using your assets? Franchises, so the operational emissions, say for example McDonald's of all the franchises. And then investment, downstream scope 3 emissions. So particular interest for maybe financial services. What's the carbon impact of the investment? Is it a fossil fuel dependent investment or otherwise? Okay, so we asked you in the survey to give an idea of either what is or what you would expect your scope 3 emissions to be as a percentage of your overall footprint. The majority of people said 50 to 75% of their emissions they would expect to be scope 3, which is quite high, but it's quite typical of what we would normally see. And then a large part of you said that you were unsure what percentage your scope 3 emissions would be, which is also not very uncommon considering how what a broad scope 3 emissions can have and how difficult it is sometimes to pinpoint it. So just to show as an example, as we saw in the, well, you may not have seen in the video, I'm not sure if you could see it correctly, but because scope 3 has such a large scope and so many categories can be included in it, oftentimes it will be the largest emission source for a lot of organizations. And this will change depending on what sector you're in and the nature of your business. Obviously, if you're an electricity generator, your scope 1 emissions are going to be way higher than your scope 3. But on average, I think it's about a 5-to-1 ratio of scope 3 emissions to scope 1 and 2 emissions for an organization. And this is just an example from Puka Tea. So they did a carbon footprint with all scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 emissions. And you can see if you look at it, that the emissions from their offices and warehouse is actually a very small percentage of their overall footprint. It's only about 3% of the emissions. Where the rest of their emissions lie is growing, processing the tea, the transportation and distribution of the tea, the end of life of the tea. And then if you look at that large purple chunk there, almost half of their emissions are attributed to use of the product. So the electricity associated with someone boiling the kettle to make a cup of Puka tea. I'm sure this is a good example to show not only how large scope 3 emissions can be in an organisation, but also the category that you think maybe is most emission intensive in scope 3. It maybe another category is larger than you think. I'm sure when they went to go do this, they didn't think that use of the product would be the largest emission source for them. So how do you measure scope 3? So we asked everyone what was the main challenges faced by your organisation in calculating scope 3 emissions. The top answer that came out was that it's very difficult to gather data. And that's a common problem we hear, obviously, because scope 3 is outside of your direct control. And then we also see some people say they just don't know where to start or they don't know how to calculate emissions. So before I get into how to actually calculate emissions, I'm going to talk a little bit about data collection, just because that seems to be the largest barrier for a lot of people. So ideally, when you are calculating emissions, in an ideal world, you'll get primary data, which is basically as directed data as you can. So if you're trying to calculate emissions from diesel combustion in a vehicle, primary data would be how many litres of diesel exactly was used in that vehicle. And that's in an ideal world. Obviously, because scope 3 oftentimes is outside of the direct control of outside the direct control of an organization, you will have to rely on secondary data when calculating emissions from this source. And there's different levels of secondary data, so you can go as estimated or as close to primary data as you can. And typically over time, people will try to improve their data collection to get it as close to primary data as they can. So let's say, for example, if you can't get liters of diesel consumed in the vehicle, maybe you know the distance that the vehicle's traveled, or you can't get that, maybe you know the step away is you can estimate the distance based on the typical routes that those vehicles take and on average how often they do those routes. Maybe you don't have that, but you can maybe do a broad extrapolation based on spend data with those vehicles. And then maybe worst case scenario, well, not worst case scenario, but maybe the most kind of secondary data you can do is just a very top level estimation just based on the number of vehicles you have and typical activity expected in your sector for those vehicles. Okay, so I'll talk a bit about now how to actually quantify emissions once you've actually gathered data. So the most common way to calculate emissions is to use emission factors. So emission factors will relate a carbon number to your activity data. So if you collect data in litres, tonnes, kilometres, emission factors will be based on databases, research or something of that sort, and will relate a carbon number of, so tonnes of carbon per litre per kilometre for whatever you've collected. Supplier specific data. So this is probably one of the best ways you can calculate emissions from Scope 3. So obviously, if it's not in your direct control, the best way to quantify emissions from that is to get direct information from whoever is in control of those emissions. So you can do this by engaging with suppliers, or I'm sure Hugo will talk once he's on about the CDP supply chain program, where you can actually ask your suppliers for emissions, for their emissions. Direct monitoring is another way to calculate emissions. So this is maybe not so common in Scope 3, where things aren't directly within your control. This is a way to calculate emissions and directly monitor, maybe, for example, directly monitoring fuel consumption within a vehicle and calculating it as you go. So environmentally standard input-output models. So these are very generalized tools, and they will basically relate spend data to emissions data, but they will do it in a very broad sense, maybe with a national inventory or maybe average of a global sector or global industry. They're not very nuanced, and they're very hard to show improvements over time because they don't really allow for that kind of subtlety, but they can be a good way for people to get started calculating a particular Scope 3 category, which they find trouble calculating. And then the last one is life cycle analysis or life cycle assessment. So this is basically a carbon footprint of a product. And I'll show you here. So it's calculating the emissions from extracting raw materials of the product, manufacturing, packaging, distribution, the use of the product and disposal. So all the emissions encompassed over the lifespan of the product from cradle to grave. And here's this example. It's another Microsoft example. But it's an LCA they've done on their Surface Pro 7, and they're able to look at this and say, okay, majority of our emissions lie in manufacturing and use of the product, and then we have a little bit in transport and a tiny piece in disposal, and they're able to come out with a carbon number then for their product. So I'm going to talk a bit about the journey of Scope 3 and how this might evolve over time. So if you're an organisation that hasn't started to calculate Scope 3 emissions yet, or doesn't know where to start, or is just starting to get on that journey, it's worth taking time to take a step back and evaluate your Scope 3 emissions. So firstly, what Scope 3 categories are relevant to your organisation? And it's no harm also to have that list out of all of the categories, because oftentimes companies will be able to name off maybe 3 or 4 of the big ones or the obvious ones, but they might miss out other ones which are actually quite a large piece of their Scope 3, which they just haven't considered. Say, for example, Puka tea. It's very easy to forget the use of the product, but it turns out being half of their emissions overall. Once you've identified what Scope 3 categories are relevant to you, what would you expect to be the most emission intensive of those categories? Just intuitively, but also it's no harm to maybe look and see at others in your field who have already calculated emissions and what are their emission breakdowns and what is coming out the highest for them. typically speaking, if you're starting your Scope 3 journey right now, there's been someone in your field who's probably been calculating emissions for 10 years, and hopefully they'll have published that maybe in a sustainability report or the website, or if they report to CDP. CDP is obviously a disclosure platform for your emissions. So if they've done a public response, you'll be able to go in and view their emissions on that if you know some of the big names in your field. So don't let perfect be the enemy of the good. And this is a very good quote to keep in mind when you're doing Scope 3. So chances are when you calculate Scope 3 emissions for the first time, you're not going to have every single relevant category in your Scope 3 calculated for year one. Some of the categories are not going to be perfect. You're maybe just getting a ballpark figure for some of them. And that's completely fine. Most companies will evolve and improve and add more scopes to their Scope 3 journey over time and improve their data collection and improve their quantification methods. So here is just an example of a graph we've done out for a clothes retailer and the Scope 3 categories that are relevant to them. So obviously it's not all 15 categories, it's only some of them. And you'll see here on the vertical axis that the higher up you go, the more of an impact that Scope 3 category has on their emissions. And then the more horizontal you go, the more difficult it is to actually collect data for that emission source and to quantify emissions from it. So if you look at the bottom corner there, you'll see waste and water. So relatively easy to collect data from that and to quantify emissions. You can just get it from a waste service provider or a water service provider. But you can see in emissions impact, it's quite a low impact in terms of emissions. It tends to be quite a small percentage of companies' overall emissions. In the top corner then, you can see as an outlier in the top right, you'll see purchase goods and services. So purchase goods and services for a retailer, if you think of every single good that's coming in through those doors, incredibly difficult to collect all of that data to quantify emissions for every single good. But that's probably where over 90% of emissions for a retailer will be. So you can see that it's very difficult to get data on, but very high impact. So it's something to always keep in mind as you go along your Scope 3 journey, that if you know that it's in a high emissions impact too, you're maybe not going to have a first year around, you're maybe not going to have a perfect couple years down the line, but it's always to try be quantifying emissions from that and improving it over time. So we have a graph here, we have a response for the survey here, which is just where we asked you what Scope 3 categories you actually currently calculate. And this is kind of typical of what we would see, just with the top ones. So waste, water, business travel, and then transport and distribution. So they're the ones that are typically easiest to get data on and to quantify emissions from. So they're ones that a lot of companies will start out on when they are quantifying Scope 3 emissions. And this is, I won't go through this, but this is just an example of a journey for someone with their Scope 3 emissions. Maybe year one, they have wastewater, bit of distribution. Year two, they've improved their distribution emissions data. They'll start doing estimations on extraction. Year three, they've improved their extraction data. They'll start getting data on usage and estimation, and so on and so forth. So I'll leave you with this. So we're going to share the slides afterwards so you'll have this, but this is just some useful resources. So the Greenhouse Gas Protocol Corporate Value Chain Standard is kind of the de facto standard on Scope 3 emissions. So would encourage you to start there if you're starting on your journey. CDP obviously has their supply chain program. They have webinars on site. Clearstream Solutions obviously is here to help. If you're an SME, Enterprise Ireland has funding and assistance available through their Green Start program. And then life cycle assessment databases, I have a few listed there. So that is all from me.